Hello and welcome to My Security TV. My name is Chris Cubbage. I'm the editor with My Security Media. Today we're joined by Sebastian Strangio, Southeast Asia editor with The Diplomat. But this is an Australian Foreign Affairs review. He's written one of the essays in here, Red Flag, China's Expanding Footprint in Southeast Asia. And without further ado, Sebastian Strangio, thanks for joining us.
That's my pleasure.
Great. Look, it is a great essay in terms of China's influence in Southeast Asia. You start off with the recent railway link between China and Laos, and I think then that was only December last year. So it's very recent. It's part of the Belt and Road Initiative from China, and I think it does underline what China is doing. And also, I think we talk a lot about Australia's link to ASEAN and Southeast Asia. We tend to talk in language of Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia, whereas you really do talk more about Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand. And I think it does divide the region in terms of how we are viewing, or how potentially also the language I see and hear with Southeast Asia. Maybe let's just talk through where those key influences are with China. And we were just speaking to Hugh White recently as well on America's influence in the region and how that's been significantly challenged. And how Southeast Asia also has issues with the United States and colonial history as well. And it's really quite a fascinating area as well, geopolitically. What sort of sparked you to name the title Red Flags, and how you approached the essay?
Well, the title was actually not my choice. I signed off on it, but it was the decision of the editors at AFA. As is usually the case. I don't know what I would have titled it. I'm actually really bad at titles, and I'm happy to do that to editors. I mean, I think that what I wanted to do with the essay is present a balanced perception of or balanced presentation of the way that China looks from a Southeast Asian perspective. Now, obviously, there's a huge variety of perspectives within each Southeast Asian country about China, but I wanted to present some of the regional nuances, I suppose, of how China's exponential meteoric growth has been interpreted in the region. I think there's a tendency in the United States, and to a certain extent in Canberra as well, to assume that the way we see the world and the way we see China is the way that other people see it as well. I think it comes down to our universalism, our sense of, we represent a set of universal values, democracy, liberal values, like human rights, and that because we frame something like China in that sort of universal term, that other nations will gravitate toward a similar sort of perspective. Yeah. And I wanted to show that actually in the region, China is viewed with a great deal more anguish and ambivalence than it is increasingly in Washington, and to a certain extent in Canberra as well.
Well, Alan Gingle, who wrote the essay just prior to yours, suggested that we engage with ASEAN. I'll call it ASEAN rather than Southeast Asia, but the ASEAN nations, rather than values, on principles. Do you think that is somewhat problematic as well, given colonial and US history within the region over the last sort of 40, 50 years as well, and even casting back? Do you think there's that mistrust on both sides from the region?
Sure. I mean, the problem with the values-based foreign policy is that it always opens you up to charges of hypocrisy and double standards. Yeah. So, a nation that comes under particular pressure from the West, and Cambodia, of course, is the cardinal example, a nation that I know fairly well, having spent 8 years living and working there as a journalist. A nation like Cambodia will point to a nation like Vietnam and say, why is the United States engaging so closely with Vietnam? Why are we being singled out? And so all of a sudden, something that's supposed to be a principled stand about values starts to look a lot more like a flag of convenience for strategic or political goals. I think that that's probably inevitable. I also think that the reality in the region is that there's few, if any, consolidated liberal democracies in Southeast Asia. And so framing things in those terms is going to leave nations a little bit, you know, slightly cold. I do think that the nations in the region have reasons to be concerned about China, but their overlap, they're not totally congruent with the concerns of the West. And as you point out, the post-colonial legacies within Southeast Asia makes Southeast Asian nations zealous in defense of their national sovereignty and very sensitive to any sort of perceptions that Western nations are looking down on them for good reason. And I think that's it's something that has been a constant friction in relations between Western countries and many of the states of Southeast Asia over the past few decades. I also think that knowledge of past transgressions committed by Western powers in Southeast Asia, whether that be formal colonization, as we saw in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, or sort of interventions like the Vietnam War by the United States that that wreaked a huge amount of destruction on Indochina in the 60s and 70s. That these things kind of undermine the West's claim to the moral high ground, I suppose.
And do you think that is going to make it harder for China too, where, as you say, they become quite zealous and nationalistic? Even you highlight there's been some pushback and protests in Myanmar against China. They just don't want these powers coming in. They have had a long history, the French and the British and the Dutch and then the Americans and now potentially China. You think that's going to force a little bit more pushback than here's another superpower coming in and trying to control us?
Sure. I think that the sensitivity about national sovereignty cuts both ways. And certainly it lies at the root of a lot of the Southeast Asian consternation about China's growing power. The difference, I suppose, with China is that China's close by. So the nations of the region have to find a way of living with China. And that China is something that they'll never be able to ignore or avoid or turn their back on, given the economic interrelationships that have grown up over the past 3 decades as China's economy has grown. And so, there's this sort of tension in the relationship about certain aspects of Chinese behavior, and that coexists also with this, the lure of opportunity, the massive amounts of trade that nations are engaging with China at the moment, and the reality that economic intercourse with China is something that can provide serious benefits, at least in theory, for the people of the region, and certainly for the governing elites of many Southeast Asian nations. And so there's this sort of like very anguish and ambivalent perspective toward China in the region, because it's something that is unavoidable and probably central to the region's future economic progress, but at the same time, also a source of growing power, and increasingly assertive in its maritime, in the maritime regions of Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, and increasingly economically dominant to an extent that threatens that, or at least is perceived to threaten people's livelihoods in other parts of Southeast Asia.
You highlight the maritime there and the maritime sort of investments that China's been making in Southeast Asia. We're also seeing that, and potentially there's learning outcomes there for the Pacific, where we're seeing China taking interest in ports in the Pacific and the Solomon Islands as well. But I think one thing you do highlight is the trade that China is doing. 2013 to 2018, total 2.37 trillion, which was up from the 1.3 trillion that the United States provided. And we do talk about, is America and the US and Western allies doing enough in the region compared to China? Do they really want it? I mean, we've got Pelosi visiting Indo-Pacific today. She's in Singapore, and how that does cause disruption to the region as well. And China prefers that not happen. Do you think America, it's maybe a direct question, is where do you see the United States and China in the region? Do you think America is deteriorating, as many commentators are, and there's no way back?
Well, there's inevitably been a relative shift in the weight of economic power between China and the United States. The position of economic dominance that the United States enjoyed at the end of the Second World War has been steadily eroded through the 20th century. And it's no surprise that that in relative terms, the U.S. has less ability to dictate the terms of of political life and diplomatic life in Asia. There's nothing really surprising about that. I
Yeah.
think the problem that the U.S. faces now is the incredible domestic political toxicity with which questions of trade are now discussed. It's virtually impossible for any U.S. president at the moment to to start talking about new free trade arrangements with Southeast Asian countries. And this is something that the problem that the Chinese government doesn't have. And China has been very enthusiastic and sort of pushing forward plans like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was actually an ASEAN initiative initially, but China's become very supportive of. And China's also going to try and bid for membership in the Comprehensive Partnership for Trans-Pacific, CPTPP. I can't remember the full acronym.
Yep.
CPTPP, which is the successor of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Donald Trump pulled the United States out of. So there's these two, large trade pacts in the Asia Pacific. China's a member of one. The second one, China wants to become a member of, and both of them exclude the United States. It's very difficult for any American president to talk seriously about market access, about lowering tariffs for Southeast Asian goods going into the United States. And these are exactly the sorts of things that Southeast Asian governments want. The recent Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was the Biden administration's attempt to provide an economic component to the Indo-Pacific strategy, which is overwhelmingly a security-focused strategy, didn't really offer much in the way of market access. It talked about sort of inclusive, pillars about, good governance and about labor protections and environmental protections and quality trade, but it didn't really offer much in the way of, it put conditions in place for participation, but it didn't offer much in terms of lures. What do we get if we, embrace this framework? What can, how will it benefit us directly? I think, American signaling toward the region is lent very heavily on values and grand proclamations of America's purpose in the world. I think a lot of this sort of reflects a moment of doubt, I think, in the United States since the election of Donald Trump. The sense of that maybe America's not as exceptional as we thought, and a sort of desire to reinvigorate that sense of exceptionalism and to recapture what many people see to be this sort of golden age, the liberal international order, the rules-based order of the post-World War II era. And so, as I mentioned before, a lot of this messaging, which is based on assumptions of American benignity and good intentions, and also, a sort of sense of universal values, that America represents to the world. This is viewed very differently in Southeast Asia. In the Southeast Asian perspective, at least from Southeast Asian governments, is much more like where, show us how we benefit from this relationship. And I think that's really the kind of yawning hole at the center of the U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia right now is simply, the lack of the trade and economic component that can really, can ensure that the United States remains a significant economic player in Southeast Asia over the long term.
Well, even from Australia's perspective, do you think the likes of, say, the Quad and AUKUS even further sort of separates us, where it's almost excluding Southeast Asia and ASEAN within that sort of allied alignment, and almost does it on purpose in a way?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on Australian foreign policy, but my sense is that Australia has always looked very much to the United States as its sort of protector. The sense that the ultimate security guarantee, Australia's ultimate security guarantee. Prior to that, it was obviously the Great Britain, and I think the sense of affinity to the West, to Western Europe, and to the United States, North America, and the democracies of this region are ultimately still what the broad mainstream of Australian foreign policy views as the guarantee of Australia's strategic autonomy. Whether Hugh White has questioned whether that can be said to be true in an era of Trumpism in the United States? And, like, can we rely on the United States? And does the United States, are they willing to go to war to protect Australian interests? That's an open question. Or it's a question that increasing numbers of people are asking because of the direction of politics in the United States and the unpredictability of American politics right now. But yeah, I mean, I think there was definitely a sense within Southeast Asia that, this was sort of the Anglosphere countries banding together. At least AUKUS I'm talking about, and that Australia is looking more further afield, and potentially neglecting its relationship with the Southeast Asian nations that are closer to it. Obviously, relations with countries like Indonesia are not without their frictions, and that is not the fault doesn't lie all on one side, of course. But I think broadly, I think Australia should be doing a lot more to understand and build sustainable long-term relationships with its Southeast Asian neighbors, for self-interested reasons of trade and investment. And also, I think that it would serve Australia's foreign policy goals fundamentally as well.
Do you think it's a struggle? Obviously, Penny Wong, our foreign minister, Malaysian-born, will assist, and we've got obviously relatively good relationship at the moment with Indonesia as well. Do you find that the fact that there's 10 Southeast Asian nations within ASEAN a challenge for Australia, and we tend to to talk to Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia more than what we probably should with the likes of Cambodia and the like? And I understand there might be some developments here for Australia with Myanmar opening up an office in Canberra. But yeah, how do you find that struggle and how that engagement needs to work from Australia's perspective?
Oh, it's challenging. I mean, a lot of it's just long-term investment in expertise on the region. I mean, obviously the university reforms that have been introduced in the last few years have made it a lot more difficult to study the sorts of subjects that would most benefit Australia in engagement with the region, languages and so forth. I think that the Labor government so far has said all the right things. I think Albanese's trip to Jakarta was well received generally by observers of Australian foreign policy. I do think there was a lot of Indonesia watchers were sort of saying, okay, let's wait and see what actually eventuates, because there's been a lot of this talk about renewed and reinvigorated relations with Indonesia before, and they've sort of founded on similar sorts of mutual misperceptions and misalignments as in the past. So we'll have to wait and see. But I think that they're saying all the right things, and it's just a matter of how far this can be sustained through the course of Albanese's term as prime minister, and then beyond. Because really there need to be long-term investments in the sorts of regional expertise that would help us bolster Australia's engagement with Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia. And of course, I do think that a lot of Australians are just congenitally more comfortable engaging with the land where a lot of white Australians come from, which is Britain, Western Europe, North America. There's a sort of cultural kinship, I think, there that still exerts a very strong attraction, as well as a sort of perceived sense of shared values, right, with these countries as liberal democracies. And I think especially in the current era of rising China, increasingly sort of menacing Russia, there has been this sort of flight into talk of like-minded countries, and I think the attempt to sort of shoehorn Modi's India into that like-minded coalition has been very awkward. And it's also very difficult, within Southeast Asia. It's hard to describe nations within the region as totally like-minded when it comes to, a lot of values. But there are principles upon which Australia can focus in base its relations with Indonesia. But I think they're much broader principles about, national self-determination and national sovereignty, which have more purchase in the region. And that might be, a better way of orienting it, rather than talking about regime type and the importance of democratic values and human rights, which, has always been a source of friction in the region.
You mentioned India there, and I take it your essay wasn't long enough to maybe consider India's influence or potential influence, because you talked about China's influence is coming from the fact that it's in Asia and directly connected at the border, but India is also going to have, or expected to have, greater influence also in the region. how do you think that potential offset there with China and India's potential influence across ASEAN?
It's still, it's a long way off. There's definitely the potential for India to play a counter, act as a counterweight to China. But
Yeah,
India's engagement with Southeast Asia is a lot less advanced on virtually every front. Even though it borders Southeast Asia, it has got this sort of buffer of Myanmar before it connects with the rest of the region. I think where India could potentially do the most good and have the most impact um, in this regard is sort of through the maritime domain. I mean, India, of course, is if we're talking about the Indo-Pacific as a strategic concept, India is sort of one anchor of that, and it could play an important role in strengthening maritime security throughout Southeast Asia and partnering with other Southeast Asian governments that share a similar concern to the Indians about Chinese intentions in the region. The recent sale of Indian Russian BrahMos supersonic missiles to the Philippines government, and a rumored purchase by the Indonesians soon, indicate that India is becoming an increasingly important defense partner in the region, and I think that there's a lot of there's a lot of room for fruitful interaction and cooperation on this. I think in terms of economics, it's probably a little bit more a little bit further off. I think that China's also has benefited from extensive networks of ethnic Chinese migrants throughout Southeast Asia that have created intricate economic networks that have helped to sort of supercharge China's economic engagement with the region. And while there are Indian diaspora communities in Malaysia and Singapore and other parts of Southeast Asia as well, the numbers are much fewer. And I think that the connections between the Indian state and these communities are looser, more less formalized. And so, for all sorts of reasons, I think there's reason to not to get too excited about India's engagement with Southeast Asia.
and maybe ASEAN as a whole, as a collective, and given its history and the amount of conflict and disagreement, it's only 1967 ASEAN was formed. We might see Timor-Leste joining ASEAN, so it's good to see it growing. But we've seen sort of the impact, say, on the Pacific islands, where China's come in and starting to influence, and it creates tension and disagreement. Do you perceive ASEAN strong enough to withstand being pulled through all of this again, or do you see quite a high risk of it splitting?
Well, I don't think that ASEAN is likely to split formally, but I think the risk is that it becomes increasingly internally divided and ineffective,
Yeah.
and increasingly sort of passed over by larger external powers. The real, the irony of ASEAN's expansion over the last, uh, 3 decades is that the post-Cold War expansion of ASEAN to include Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam um, made ASEAN in many ways synonymous with Southeast Asia. Obviously, Timor-Leste remains outside of ASEAN. Of course, Timor-Leste was not an independent nation at the end of the Cold War, but its inclusion would complete Southeast ASEAN's, including all of the generally recognized nations of Southeast Asia. But for the most part, if we put Timor-Leste to one side, people speak of ASEAN and Southeast Asia as interchangeable. So, at the very moment that ASEAN became, embraced the majority of the region, it also increased the diversity of views within ASEAN. So, in the nations, of mainland Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, they have a different, obviously different perspective with regard to China. Then and that's increased the plurality of views within ASEAN. And because ASEAN operates by consensus, and any single member can block any statement or any policy or any initiative, it gives the Chinese government, and
Yeah.
potentially other outside governments as well, a much greater ability to play one member off against the rest. And we've sort of saw that with the Cambodian government in 2012, blocking a statement about the South China Sea. Um, that was mildly critical of Chinese actions at Scarborough Shoal that year. And so we've seen, the Chinese relationship with the governing elites of Laos and Cambodia is incredibly close. And they benefit very directly from inflows of Chinese investment and trade. And so, they potentially could act as spoilers within ASEAN. And I think that, we see this sort of paralysis over what to do about the situation in Myanmar. You have, the 9 other member states of ASEAN have so far failed to agree to anything but the most sort of lowest common denominator approach toward the situation in Myanmar. And there's increasing calls now for ASEAN to reassess its approach to that conflict because it hasn't worked. It's conceded too much to the military junta. It's being too, in some ways, assumed its goodwill that has very much not been forthcoming. And so, and these are the sorts of ways in which ASEAN could potentially be paralyzed. Is that simply the nations of ASEAN can't agree on a way forward, and China is one of those issues that not all Southeast Asian countries have the same view about.
One last question. There was consideration to whether Australia would join ASEAN. What would be your general thought on that? Never going to happen, or do you think into the future it may assist somehow?
I don't think it'll ever happen. I think it's an idea that's raised every now and again, and it sounds good on paper, but it's I think Australia can benefit from economic interaction with Southeast Asia through free trade arrangements and other forms of membership in larger trade pacts. There's no need necessarily for it to do that, and I think that there'd have to be a lot greater alignment of threat perceptions and strategic worldviews, I suppose, for that to even be on the agenda. But it's something that raises its head every now and again. It sounds like a good idea in theory.
Fair enough. Well, look, one area I didn't quite cover, and we'll let the audience wanting more for them to read this particular edition of the Foreign Affairs and your particular essay, is China's influence within the maritime sector. And you did mention that, and I think that's one of the key sort of areas of influence, particularly when we're looking at a higher sort of tension and confrontation potential with the United States. Obviously, the maritime domain is a key one, but it's also a key factor within the trade as well. So between Southeast Asian nations. So Sebastian Strangio, thank you so much for your time. You're the Southeast Asia editor with The Diplomat, and your essays in the latest edition of the Foreign Affairs. We'll have the link to this particular edition in the show notes. So thank you very much for joining us on Tech and Sec Weekly, MySec TV.
All right. Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Good on you, mate.